I ran through the campaign and some very early mapping as Pohx Rohx Fire Chieftain. This has been by far the most requested build for me to try out for my earlier videos, and as the saying goes, you gotta give the people what they want. Now this is Pohx Rohx Fire build, which is redundant really. If it's Righteous Fire, it is a Pohx build. So given that this is someone else's build, this is not going to be a guide, it's going to be more of a review of Righteous Fire as a concept, but I can't help myself, I will sprinkle in some tips and stuff along the way. So let's just get right into it, but first, don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, right, this is Pohx Rohx Fire build. If you're somehow unfamiliar with Pohx, I don't know how, but he's a fantastic PoE content creator, and he's been doing it for like around a decade. He's the guru of Righteous Fire, and ironically also a very chill dude. He's created a wiki for Righteous Fire, pohx.net. I'll put that in the description rather than like a POB. You can get it from his website. I think that's, you know, more reasonable. He's also created countless guides on how to play this build as a variety of different ascendancies over the years, and like in both SSF and trade leagues, and I think even hardcore as well. It's very much his area of expertise. Just kind of by playing it and choosing to talk about it, I'm really stepping into his world. Now my plan was to just play the build straight up as the guide is written and then evaluate it from there. I did spend some time looking at it and like thinking about ways I could maybe streamline things throughout the process of doing the campaign, but I can't. It's already great. He's put years of time into making this guide, and it really shows. There's a lot of time and love here. It's very thorough. I certainly can't do a better job of teaching you to play RF than Pohx can, and it would be stupid of me to even try, but what I can do is talk about it as a build and give some thoughts on what I think is good and bad about RF, and hopefully help you in deciding whether or not it's the build that you want to play as your league starter in patch 3.25. So I'll just start with my history of playing RF. I have played it a lot. I played it before I knew who Pohx was, but I have also played several of his versions over the years as well, and they are better. I mean, there's a reason he's the guru of RF. I never really loved RF Inquisitor, and even though, I mean, I played it a lot, I played it all the way to the point of like farming a mage blood and taking it through endgame and stuff, but it just really was never my favorite. It's probably the strongest version of RF that I ever played, certainly the strongest character I ever made, but the stop and start play style that is required to keep Inquisitor's Pious Path active while trying to map quickly is just very tedious to me. It's not really even that hard, like just to show off in game. Really all you have to do is just kind of shield charge often, and like that will accomplish stopping and starting as an Inquisitor, but it just was one more thing to track that I just really don't like. I don't like that about Inquisitor, and I think because of that, Chieftain as an Ascendancy choice is just a much more well-rounded and like better option than basically anything that was popular in the past, most notably Inquisitor and Juggernaut. In terms of my general thoughts on Righteous Fire, I do like it. I have never loved it, and I think the reason why I feel that way will become apparent in the pros and cons section of the video, so let's just get to that right now. First off, pro number one, and I think the main appeal of the build for 95% of the people who play it, is that it has a very smooth play style. There is very little player input required while mapping. You basically just turn on RF, and then you just zip through the maps as quickly as you can, and everything dies. This means you consistently get a lot of XP during the campaign as well, which is really good. There's very little effort required. You never fall behind in levels because you're just killing everything by walking by it. And that makes the campaign very easy. You're always up to snuff, up to level when it comes to getting to bosses. Also, the Chieftain Ascendancy just absolutely rocks. Like, just to look at the POB here, you know, every single one of these Ascendancy nodes that you take, you are using every single aspect of them. You're using all of this one, you're using all of this one, and this one. There is no fat in this Ascendancy at all. Additionally, you have extremely easy gearing, mainly because of Tesaleo, Cleansing Water, and Valakos Storm's Embraced. You just are able to like stack fire res and life, and that's not all you have to do for defenses, but it is a huge part of all that you have to do for defenses. And not having to get fire, cold, and lightning resistances independently of each other, just stacking fire res and being fine is such good quality of life. It also is a build that has extremely high life regen. You are very tanky against damage over time effects. A lot of this does come from the incredible quality of life of Tesaleo Cleansing Water, where you're able to just stack fire res to the moon. That then also just straight up turns directly into life regen. It's certainly not the only source of life regen, but it is a really big one. Now, because of that, you're also able to use life tap support. You can basically just ignore mana as a mechanic entirely, which is always something I love to do. This is doable actually pretty early on in the campaign as well, which is really fantastic. I mean, I think around like level 30 or so, you can get away with just life tapping everything if you feel like it and never think about mana again. There's also just really good quality of life in this build. You can ignore or diminish a lot of annoying map mods. We're talking about things like Reflect, Cannot Leech, Increase Monster Resistances, and like zone-wide curses. You know, you're constantly cursed by temp chains. Not a problem. Ignore it. This is also a build that transitions into Fizz taken as Ellie pretty easily. It's also just a very forgiving build. It's easy to play, it's really easy to gear, it is a safe build, and that makes it good for players who want to start a build that isn't going to be stressful on them. You know, it doesn't have a ton of keybinds, it's not really a super active playstyle. And then finally, it has an extremely high level of community support, and most of that is thanks to Pohx. You always have a resource, pretty much because of him, that will help guide you in progressing your character. You're never going to hit a point where you stall and you have no idea what to do and there are no resources for it. And now for the cons, and this is maybe the biggest one for me, but it has a very slow start, like very slow. You are actually kind of given a lot to deal with as a newer player in particular. You have to mule some gems to yourself as a level 4 witch. You have to like start out by playing a witch, take it up to level 4, which isn't a lot. It only takes a little bit, but it is something that is not normal for most builds, not normal for most players. There is also just a lot of using like off-meta gems, off-meta socket colors, and just a difficult stat budget that you have to account for in the first 15 to 20 levels of playing a Marauder, which normally is built around strength. The game is kind of tailored around you having a bunch of strength stuff and red gem sockets, and that is just not how you start out this build. For what it's worth, Pohx's guide presents all of this information in a way that I think is easy to follow, but it's just a lot of information to manage all at once, and that can be overwhelming for a newer player. It's also, given that it's something that you don't do in the vast majority of builds, it can be potentially kind of confusing. And then just by being kind of slow at the start of making a new character, that can be a little bit to kill people's enthusiasm. It's definitely done it for me. Also, the damage in single target is not great. At the highest ends of gear progression, super high end, you're going to be pushing maybe 8 to 15 million DPS if you're really, really slamming. That's not a lot. And the in-game damage scaling is just always going to kind of be like that. It's just never going to be a massive amount of damage, even at a really high gear level. It's also kind of a slow build. You are basically a big, lumbering fireball. You move slow, you attack slow, you do everything slow. This is a build that has a passive playstyle, and I think that is basically the flip side of the part in the positives where I said that it's very forgiving. And it is easy to play, but also, I'm different. I was born with Mountain Dew in my veins, just like sitting and waiting and kind of doing nothing while enemies burn to death around me is the hardest thing in the world for me. It is the bane of my existence in life and in video games to just do nothing. I always press aggressively when I play FIFA. I try to weave in too many hits when I fight bosses in Soulsborne games. I can't just sit and wait, and that is a lot of what this build is about when you're pushing more difficult content. It's just kind of waiting and dodging. I have to admit that this gets kind of boring for me. Even if I feel like I'm having a good time, I'm really not doing very much while I'm playing Righteous Fire, and I don't love that. It's not totally passive. You have fire traps to throw out, and you can move around enemies, but it is still a fairly slow-paced build, especially compared to a lot of the builds that I really prefer, like Pathfinder builds. Case in point, my channel manager walked by and looked at me as I was fighting Kitava in Act 10, probably the most involved thing I did in the campaign, and said, "You look bored." Yeah, I wasn't having a bad time, but I wasn't really doing much. I was just kind of hanging out, watching Kitava slowly burn to death. Now, also the self-degen that you have in this build by setting yourself on fire with Righteous Fire means that mechanics that disable or outscale your life regen, so we're talking Cirrus ground pools, cannot regen life over 50%, rare monster affixes, or just having a massive amount of poison stacks will become extremely dangerous. And also, it's a build that, despite being super tanky against damage over time effects, having sort of a reputation of being super tanky, it's not actually very tanky in terms of max hit. This is not necessarily a problem until it is. Defiance of Destiny makes you insanely tanky when you're just walking through maps, dealing with regular monsters, and, you know, then you eat a large hit, a big enough hit to fully one-shot you, and you are now dead. And this means once you are well geared, you can pretty much feel unkillable most of the time, but prior to that point, it can actually be a little scary to play Righteous Fire. Alright, what makes the build work? Righteous Fire and the Chieftain Ascendancy are the two main things that make Righteous Fire Chieftain work. This makes sense, right? It is Righteous Fire Chieftain. You would expect RF and Chieftain to play an important role, and they both do. RF is a unique skill. It sets you on fire, as you can see here. It cannot be disabled once it's activated, like I'm clicking the button for it and it's not doing anything. And it causes you to burn nearby enemies for a percentage of your life. Now, one thing that maybe I could have put in the cons section if I just jump into an act here, like, okay, let's go to the Blood Aqueducts, you'll see, by changing zones, by entering a map or whatever, it turns off and you do have to re-enable it every time. Not a huge deal, but it is something you have to actually do. But as you can see, I'm just walking around and everything is burning up. Now, because the build burns nearby enemies for a percentage of your life, this means you can increase your damage with normal damage stats, fire damage over time, multi, fire damage, all the usual stuff, but also you can increase it by increasing your life pool. Now, damage stats are obviously going to be much better at increasing your damage, naturally, but still getting a non-zero damage increase just by having more health is cool and good. Chieftain is also a big part of why this build works so well. You really do make use of all 4 Chieftain Ascendancy nodes, which is something I guess you could say about some of the other Ascendancies that have been used and been more popular in the past, but I don't really think any of them have been as effective as Chieftain is now. The tankiness that you get from these 2 Ascendancy nodes right here, Tesalio Cleansing Water and Valaco Storm's Embrace, is really powerful defensively, especially once you're built to convert a huge chunk of your physical damage taken into elemental damage, but also you get 2 really strong offensive nodes in the form of Ramako Sun's Light and Hinekora Death's Fury. Ramako makes it so that you're always able to bring enemy fire resistances down just by standing still, and this means you don't have to use a Flammability Curse, something to reduce enemy fire resistance. You can use other curses to increase their damage taken, things like Punishment, which will serve as kind of halfway between an offensive and a defensive curse. That's pretty cool. And then Hinekora basically just gives you a bunch of clear. It really isn't any more complicated than that. Just sometimes you'll get massive clear as you're pathing through maps, and by having more enemies around to explode with Hinekora's Death's Fury, that just means more damage. If I had to point at anything that I think is kind of weak in the Ascendancy, it is Ramako. You know, it's not a perfect node by any stretch. It does require you to stand still, which is a bit at odds with the approach while mapping of like constantly moving through areas. But for bigger guys who you need to stop and throw fire traps at, it will cause you to immediately shred them. You know, they go from having whatever fire res they have to exactly minus 20 fire res, and now they're just getting destroyed. Now let's shift over to uniques, and one of the biggest positives of this build is that it is super flexible gear-wise. You can absolutely just run all rares, total SSF approach, that does work, but there are some really valuable uniques as well. It's just that the amount of them that you're really searching for that are like mandatory-ish or highly desirable is very low. The first one that you're going to want early on in a league, maybe the most valuable one for the build on the whole, would be Immortal Flesh, which is really just a very like life-oriented belt. It gives you anywhere from like 100 to 140 max life, which is pretty great. That is a massive amount of life for a belt. And then more importantly, it gives you anywhere from 200 to 350 life per second, which is insane. The thing with this belt is like, yes, you do get a bit of minus elemental resistances, but you are so over the cap for resistances that it really doesn't matter. Like, I'm at 134 fire res, you know, over 100 all res right now in this gear, and I'll just show off some of this character's gear. Behold the incredible gear that I am wearing on this character. A blue helm, just garbage gear that I killed Kitava wearing. I think the only piece of gear that I have equipped that I think is actually somewhat decent is probably this belt and this pair of 30% move speed boots with almost 50 life. This character's gear is exceedingly terrible. Genuinely first 8 hours of a league level of bad, and even so I am very easily over the resistance cap, pretty much entirely due to Tesalio Cleansing Water. Alright, let's take a look at a couple of more uniques here that I think are kind of valuable. Rise of the Phoenix is another really good one. Again, it gives you a lot of life regen. It gives you increased fire res, both fire res and max fire res. So you're going to have a very easy time getting up to, or at least really close to 90 fire res, which thanks to Valaco Storm's Embrace, that will then put all of your elemental resistances at 90. So this is something that you can realistically get on like day 1 or day 2 of a league, 90 all res. That's pretty crazy. And then, you know, you get a little bit of extra value when you're on low life, a little bit of like move speed and fire res, and then just good defensive value in general out of the shield. And then I think the third most valuable unique, and one that I actually got lucky and did pick up while leveling, was Kikazaru. And this little ring here is super valuable, I think, primarily because it doesn't really have any meaningful rolls on it. The regen 3 life per second per level. At level 50, this is 150 life per second. That is an insane amount for a ring, and that's midway through the campaign, a little bit after midway through the campaign. I think that's around when I got mine. I got lucky, but this is a ring that is super common. It is like 1 chaos or so, even on league start. And good rolls don't really matter because the only roll that even has any impact at all would be anywhere from 10 to 15 all stats. You're not that starved for stats that you need to pay a massive amount to get 5 more decks. Really all you have to do is level up, and you're just getting all of the value out of this just simply by hitting level 80, 90, 100. You're getting anywhere from 240 to 300 life per second, which is crazy. And then reduced effective curses is also really valuable. This makes it so that it's super easy to be very nearly curse immune just with like a sulfur flask or something, having consecrated ground under your feet. And yeah, just to double check here, the price on day 1 for this ring, this insanely good ring here, is 3 chaos. I think everyone can pretty much manage to afford that. There is another shield option that you can use instead of Rise of the Phoenix, and that would be Dawnbreaker. Now, this does come from the Searing Exarch, so it's definitely something you can get in the first weekend of a league. It's really not going to be that expensive, and it's not necessarily required as opposed to Rise of the Phoenix. It just sort of shifts your defenses around instead of having a bit higher all res and a bit easier time getting your fire res up. You are able to convert a lot of damage into fire damage, and that means physical damage into fire damage is really what you're looking for. You do get Scorch when you block, which is okay, but of extra damage. You know, pretty good block chance on this shield as well. So it's a pretty nice shield. Usually doesn't go for all that much. Maybe during the first weekend of a league, it can be kind of expensive, but there's a pretty cheap alternative, so you're good. All right, normally this is the point where I would talk about the PoB, but, you know, it's not my PoB, so I don't really feel super comfortable doing a detailed breakdown. I will just say that for the approach that I took and kind of the path I wanted for leveling, you're able to use Righteous Fire at level 16. The thing that really is required for using Righteous Fire at that level is this Fire Mastery right here. So an important part of getting the Fire Res available to like really kickstart this Fire Mastery and make it so that you're able to use Righteous Fire at level 16 or around level 16 is fire resistance rings. And so an easy way to just jumpstart those is to get some iron rings. You can potentially buy them from Yena in Act 2, or I'm blanking on her name in Act 1. Nessa in Act 1, I believe. Yeah, you can buy those from Yena or Nessa potentially, or just find them while leveling. And then you just want to have some red gems. You'll get a lot of red gems that you're not going to have any use for as quest rewards. So hang on to those, because you can vendor those just like this, and it'll turn into a ruby ring. That'll give you anywhere from 20 to 30 fire res, just baseline as a white ring. You can wear 2 white ruby rings, that's fine. You can also go to your hideout, and if you have 1 transmute orb, you can craft, hey, I have 1 lying around here that I prepped for this. So you can craft on 16 to 20 fire res as well. At level 17 or 18 or whenever I remember to do it, I did this, and this was the extent of the fire res I had, was just like 2 ruby rings with fire res crafted on them. That's all that there was to them, and that's kind of all I needed. Just those 2 rings will give you close to 100 fire res, which is more than enough to get Righteous Fire up and running just on its own without anything else at all in your gear. And then if you have fire res anywhere else in your gear, that really makes it easy. And so once I had gotten this wheel and had my fire res all up and running, then I came down here and took Barbarism, got the fire res, max fire res from that, a bit more life. And then I progressed through Pohx's tree exactly as he has it listed out. And he does a pretty good job, I think, in the first 2. So, you know, level 1 to 40 basically is kind of just holding your hand and showing you exactly where to go. And then in the 40 to 60 and the 60 to 80 ranges, he kind of gives you pretty broad options here, where you have a lot of defensive stuff down here. You have max res down here, max res and armor here, life here. You have a lot of damage stuff in this area, a lot of damage stuff up in this area, a lot of damage over here. And you can kind of mix and match based on how you feel the build is going for you. If you feel like you're feeling pretty tanky and you don't really need tankiness or more defenses, you need more damage, go for the damage first. If you need more tankiness, you're killing stuff fine, but you're kind of squishy, pick up a little bit more defensive stuff, maybe get yourself some more XP, just stop and kill some guys as well, kind of level up and get a bit more life. So I think pretty good, and really I have no criticisms at all of the build. You know, it's quite good. I think he also does a good job of laying out how you're going to want to transition into the end game here as well, and go from having no cluster jewels into one and then a second one. This is all very well laid out, and frankly something that I kind of drew some inspiration from when I was working on my own Toxic Rain Pathfinder guides as well. Okay, I will briefly mention the Ascendancies just to kind of be thorough. I do think the first Ascendancy node that you want to take is Tessalio Cleansing Water. It just makes it so that you very easily cap all of your resistances, and this is one of my favorite aspects of playing a Chieftain in a League start situation or a solo self-found situation. You finish Act 5, you kill Kitava, your resistances go down, and on basically every other Ascendancy, you now suffer this like shock of defensive value. You take a lot more damage from all elemental resistance area sources, and that's just not true for Chieftain at all. You are so easily over the resistance cap just by having Tessalio and stack and a little bit of fire res that little hurdle never occurs for Chieftain builds at all. Then after that, you know, you can take Ramako Sunslight. I think that's probably the best one because it'll make you deal more damage against single targets, and you tend to get stalled more on single targets than you do like have trouble clearing in AoE. But on the other hand, if you wanted to take Hinakura Death's Fury and have a really easy time just mowing down the trash as you zip through areas, I could understand it. But right, the recommendation, I think I would stick with it, is Tessalio, Ramako, Hinakura, and then finish with Valako, Storm's Embrace. Getting your cold and light res up to the level of your fire res is definitely the last sort of most important thing, unless you're playing this as a hardcore build, and then yeah, maybe you would want to do that first, but maybe you'd rather just play Jug entirely if you're going hardcore. All right, as for skills, and specifically while leveling, I think maybe one of the biggest things that I find kind of frustrating about this build, about a lot of leveling builds early on, is that you really do want to run Rolling Magma, which is why you have to mule things over to yourself by playing a witch up to level 4, not leveling any of the gems on the witch, so you can then transfer them back over to your Marauder and then play with them from there. And I'm just not a Rolling Magma enjoyer. I do like Flame Wall, I like Holy Flame Totem, I think those are both really great while leveling, but Rolling Magma in Act 1, just not my favorite. Once you get into Act 2, and you're able to get Righteous Fire up and running just by like using those rings, using that mastery, I think that is when the build really starts to work. And once you kind of get into the level 30 plus range, I really think it starts to pull ahead of some of the other builds that I played, some of the attack-based builds where you're still kind of fiddling with mana. At that point, Righteous Fire Chieftain basically stops having to worry about mana if you want, and it feels a lot better. With that being said, you do have to buy basically all of the support gems that you want for the campaign. All of those have to come from doing Syosa's quest in the library. You also want to do that to like get Fire Trap and Armageddon Brand. And Armageddon Brand is pretty cool. I like it a lot more than Fire Trap, to be honest, but Fire Trap is just way better, so you could probably just forgo Armageddon Brand entirely. The only real issue with running Fire Trap is that it requires some green gem sockets, at least 2, one for Fire Trap and one for Trap and Mind Damage, but ideally, it would be better if this were Swift Affliction instead of Combustion support, I think, but, you know, it is what it is. And then I have Life Tap support here, obviously, but, like, as you can see, these gloves are terrible. The reason that I'm continuing to wear this 15 evasion rating, 5 energy shield pair of gloves is because they have green sockets on them, and that is it. And that's kind of one of the tougher constraints during the campaign, is just simply you are really, like, socket pressured throughout the campaign. Okay, as with other builds, I'm going to rank this one on a scale of fun to not fun. Do I think that this is a fun build? Yeah, I think it's a very good build and an even better guide. I would put it below the other 2 builds that I played in terms of my personal enjoyment, and that is because it is very passive and quite a bit slower than either of them. It is smooth and steady, and it actually handled the last couple of campaign bosses really well, but it was quite a lot slower than either of them in the campaign from like start to finish, and I wasn't stopping and writing a guide while doing the whole campaign this time. I was just going for it the whole time and still wound up being slower. I think maybe the biggest issue I have with Righteous Fire builds is that Righteous Fire is a skill that excels at a very specific application, and that is smooth, easy mapping. You can absolutely incinerate everything in a basic T16 Alk and Go map, and do it pretty easily, and that is awesome. That is the main gameplay loop for the majority of people who play this game, which that's great. It's a perfect build for that. The problem with it is trying to take on other, harder content. It can do it, it can work. Especially once you're really well geared, then Righteous Fire works really well. But ice cream can also be breakfast. It doesn't mean that it's ideal. Righteous Fire can clear tier 17s and uber bosses. Of course it can. But it isn't a super well-rounded build. It is a build that does smooth mapping extremely well and everything else kinda decent. And Pohx would agree here. It's not that Righteous Fire can't kill bosses or it's even bad at bossing, it's just not optimal for it. It's like using a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. You can do it, but it's not the tool for the job. And this is something that's true of a lot of builds. Bone Zone Juggernaut, Toxic Rain Pathfinder. These are also much better at mapping than they are at bossing as well. I think the difference for Righteous Fire specifically for me is that it feels much slower than those other builds, since it has a less active playstyle, more than an actual disparity in performance. It really is about the feel of the build. So this is a build I've played in League Start Practice a lot of times, and I've played it several times in previous leagues for real as well. I've played it a lot, I've taken it all the way through the end game, and it is good. Having played several other Ascendancies and versions of Righteous Fire, I do think this is my favorite one thus far. Chieftain is such an enjoyable Ascendancy when you're operating on a League Start or SSF budget. It is so easy to hit all the important gearing checkpoints like resistances and stat requirements because of this Ascendancy. There's usually a bit of a drop-off in tankiness after each time you kill Kitava, since you need to upgrade some gear and get your resistances back up to par, and that just never happens as Chieftain at all, which is so good. Both Act 5 and Act 10 just completely flat, like stepping over that threshold and not experiencing any kind of fall off at all, really makes me like Chieftain. It has really rocketed up as one of my favorite Ascendancies. I also think I'd be underselling the smoothness to just recommend this as a new player build. I think the slower pace is good for newer players, but it is a build that can appeal to a broad range of players. It has great clear. There is a lot of freedom while gearing, and that is why this build is a classic. Like a lot of the traditional favorite League Start builds, this is one that can withstand a lot of nerfs and changes to the game, and it's flexible enough to take advantage of new mechanics, buffs, and new uniques. It's a really good build, and Pohx's guides for it are outstanding. So yes, I would recommend it. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.